Everyone tells you the same comforting lie about trading, the same myth whispered in books and forums. Put in 10,000 hours and mastery will appear. But the brutal truth professionals accept and amateurs resist is far harsher. Time alone means nothing without directed focus on pivotal moments. You can sit at screens for years and still remain confused, emotional, and inconsistent. Most traders do not fail because they lack hours. They fail because their hours dissolve into noise. They jump between strategies, chase signals, and hope effort transforms into expertise. Professionals know the opposite is true. Only deliberate concentration on one setup creates progress worth compounding. This contrast defines the real divide between hobbyist wandering and structured development. And it sets the stage for the deeper question that shapes all mastery. What actually builds skill? Consider Alex, a typical retail trader who believes consistency will eventually appear if he simply works harder and logs more screen time. He wakes early to scroll charts, squeezes analysis into lunch breaks, and studies indicators late into the night. 3 years pass and thousands of hours vanish, yet his equity curve refuses to rise. The problem is not laziness. It is scattered intention. One week he scalps momentum spikes, the next he experiments with swing signals, and soon after he flips into fading moves whenever boredom strikes. Every reset erases whatever progress he briefly made. His mind never gathers enough repetition to understand any pattern deeply. He thinks this struggle is normal, but it is simply the cost of operating without focus. Hard work is present, but growth is absent. Now compare Alex with a professional who understands that mastery requires less motion and more intention. This trader spends just 90 focused minutes each morning reviewing one specific setup. Always the same structure, the same risk protocol, the same confirmation cues. They are not hunting excitement. They are refining precision. Their stop-loss logic never changes. Their position sizes remain stable, and their entry criteria stay painfully clear. No distractions, no improvisation, no noise masquerading as information. After only a few months of repeated exposure to the same pattern, their progress accelerates faster than Alex's did in 3 full years. Repetition reveals nuance, and nuance becomes instinct. What amateurs try to achieve with time, professionals achieve with focus. Here lies the first maxim that separates serious development from blind effort. Hours do not create mastery. Precision does. Amateurs hate this line because it demands responsibility rather than comfort. They want to believe that the market eventually rewards persistence. But persistence without direction becomes a treadmill. Professionals understand that trading is not a game of endurance. It is a game of clarity. Each minute should reinforce a pattern, strengthen a memory, or sharpen a rule. Everything else becomes wasted motion disguised as dedication. When you concentrate on one edge, every repetition builds a deeper internal model of how price behaves around that structure. This accumulation of subtle recognition becomes the true foundation of mastery. This leads directly to the hidden rule amateurs rarely hear but professionals live by. Waiting is a position, but only if you know exactly what you are waiting for. Most traders wait emotionally, staring at screens and hoping for opportunity, yet they have no defined setup anchored in prior repetitions. Their waiting becomes anxiety, not strategy. Professionals wait with purpose because their focus gives them a narrow target. They recognize their pattern instantly and remain inactive until those conditions align. This selective patience lifts them above noise and shields them from impulsive trades. Waiting becomes one of the most powerful tools in their arsenal precisely because it is anchored in clarity. Thousands of hours cannot compensate for randomness, and this is where most aspiring traders derail their development. They assume that more exposure automatically produces understanding, but exposure without structure overwhelms rather than educates. Their minds absorb fragments instead of frameworks. They accumulate stress instead of skill. Professionals invert this equation. They choose one edge, study its rhythm, learn its failures, and review every variation until the behavior becomes familiar. This focus allows each hour to compound, not scatter. The difference is dramatic. Amateurs put in time. Professionals build memory. Memory becomes recognition, and recognition becomes confidence. And here the first major loop of this chapter opens. If mastery is not ours, then what exactly is it? If thousands of trades do not guarantee progress, what does? These questions matter because they expose the flaw in the 10,000-hour myth. The myth assumes that quantity becomes quality, but trading punishes quantity and rewards precision. Skill forms when the mind encounters the same pattern repeatedly, under consistent rules, with consistent evaluation. This is the process athletes use, musicians use, and elite performers in every field use. Trading is no different, except the market charges tuition with real losses when focus collapses. Mastery becomes engineered, not accidental. This chapter dismantles the comforting belief that mastery is merely a matter of time invested. It reveals the uncomfortable truth that time can mislead traders into thinking they are improving when they are only repeating unfocused habits. Amateurs cling to this belief because it absolves them from choosing a direction. If time alone guarantees progress, then scattered behavior feels acceptable. But as Alex's story illustrates, scattered learning produces stagnation. Professionals rise above this trap by committing to one edge long enough for meaningful recognition to form. This is not restrictive. It is liberating. It frees them from confusion and creates a foundation where every decision feels grounded rather than reactive. Another crucial element embedded within this chapter is the identity divide between amateurs and professionals, an essential psychological anchor for every trader who wants to mature. Amateurs identify with activity. They believe showing up equals effectiveness. Their metric is effort, not outcome. Professionals identify with precision. They value clean execution, small risk, and disciplined selectivity. Their metric is quality, not volume. This identity shift transforms how traders interpret progress. Instead of asking, "How many hours did I trade?" professionals ask, "How many focused repetitions strengthened my edge today?" This question reframes the entire pursuit. It forces clarity, removes ego, and eliminates the illusion that random effort accumulates into expertise. Through this lens, mastery becomes less about endurance and more about constructing a repeatable process that compounds over time. The scenario of Alex also exposes an overlooked truth about emotional fatigue. Scattered learning exhausts traders because the brain cannot build stable neural pathways when patterns constantly change. This fatigue masquerades as burnout, but it is actually cognitive overload. Professionals avoid this entirely because narrow repetition conserves psychological energy. When you practice one setup repeatedly, the mind begins to automate recognition. This automation reduces emotional turbulence, making execution cleaner and decision-making faster. Alex, on the other hand, is always on high alert because nothing feels predictable. Every trade feels like a new environment, and that novelty increases fear and doubt. The professional pathway removes novelty and replaces it with familiarity. Familiarity lowers fear, and lowered fear unlocks consistent behavior. This entire discussion naturally transitions into the deeper mystery seated at the end of the chapter. If mastery is not a product of hours, then what structure actually produces it? The upcoming answer, explored in later sections, is that mastery emerges from selective focus, systematic repetition, and strategic patience. But even before introducing those elements, Chapter 1 establishes why such a system is necessary. Without focus, repetition becomes impossible. Without repetition, recognition never forms. Without recognition, fear rules every decision. And without emotional stability, no trader can execute cleanly enough to grow. In this sense, the rejection of the 10,000-hour myth is not about dismissing effort. It is about redefining effort as intentional, structured, and measurable. Time becomes a tool, not a crutch. The opening loop of this chapter points toward the viewer's next transformation, understanding how professionals design their focus so tightly that improvement becomes inevitable. This loop is intentional because it keeps the mind leaning forward, searching for the mechanism behind progress. Humans crave causality. They want to know why pros advance faster with fewer hours. The answer, revealed later, is that focus condenses experience. When your energy concentrates on one behavior, each iteration strengthens the neural pathways governing recognition, execution, and emotional regulation. This is the opposite of the amateur's approach, where scattered behavior dilutes learning and keeps the brain in survival mode. The chapter uses Alex and the professional trader as reflections of two psychological universes, one driven by randomness and hope, the other by clarity and disciplined repetition. This duality prepares the audience to understand the architecture of mastery. Finally, this chapter ends on a deliberate cliffhanger because anticipation strengthens retention and encourages deeper reflection before moving forward. The viewer is left holding a provocative question. If mastery is not built on 10,000 hours, then what foundation truly supports consistent growth in trading? This unanswered tension serves a purpose. It mirrors the uncertainty traders face and hints that clarity will come from structure, not time. By highlighting the failures of scattered effort and contrasting them with the rapid progress created by focused repetition, the chapter positions the audience to accept a new framework. They begin recognizing that mastery is engineered, not gifted, and certainly not earned through sheer endurance. This prepares them to absorb the deeper rules revealed next: the discipline of filtering, the psychology of waiting, and the architecture of a single profitable edge. The transition feels natural, and the curiosity it generates becomes the fuel for the chapters that follow. Most traders believe focus is something you force: an act of mental strain, a tightening of attention, a desperate attempt to stare harder at the screen. They think intensity equals clarity, but professionals understand a truth that flips the amateur worldview upside down. Focus isn't effort. Focus is elimination. It's the deliberate removal of everything that distracts, dilutes, or destabilizes your edge. Amateurs pile information onto their screens because they're scared to miss something. Professionals strip information away because they're scared to pollute their judgment. This difference doesn't seem dramatic at first, but it explains almost every gap in consistency, confidence, and performance between the two groups. Amateurs open 10 charts at once, load 5 news feeds, stack indicators until price is barely visible, and then wonder why their mind feels like a battlefield of conflicting signals. They confuse activity with awareness. They assume that more data equals more control. But every extra panel, every added indicator, every conflicting analysis is a new variable the brain must interpret under pressure. The market already asks for rapid decisions. Layering complexity on top of that destroys your ability to act cleanly. The result is paralysis by excess, not empowerment. Information overload increases emotional volatility because the mind senses uncertainty, and uncertainty always fuels fear. Amateurs respond to that fear by searching for even more information, creating a loop where confusion expands exponentially. Consider Rafi, a novice trader who believes his inconsistency can be solved by more tools and more analysis. He builds complex watch lists, installs multiple alert systems, adds moving averages on top of oscillators, and subscribes to economic calendars that buzz every hour. The more data he consumes, the more anxious he becomes. Every signal seems to contradict another. Price breaks above one indicator but fails another. Volume spikes, but the moving average slopes down. A news headline hints bullish, but another warns of risk. With this much noise attacking his attention, Rafi's decisions degrade quickly. His position sizes fluctuate because he loses trust in his entries. His stop losses widen when fear spikes or tighten randomly when he wants reassurance. He tells himself he's analyzing. He believes he's being thorough, but deep down, he's drowning in noise. His mind is suffocating under the weight of information he never needed in the first place. Professionals take the opposite path. They understand that focus is fundamentally a filter, not an effort. They don't try harder to concentrate. They remove everything that doesn't directly strengthen their edge. They know the brain performs best under simplicity and repetition. Every additional decision the brain must make weakens its performance under pressure. So pros design their environment to minimize decisions. They choose one edge, one setup, one structure. They build rules not to control the market but to control themselves. and they cut everything else. I once heard a prop mentor articulate this principle in a way that burned itself permanently into my thinking. "You want mastery?" he said. "Focus on the one setup that pays your rent. Delete the rest." He wasn't exaggerating. This trader had become one of the most consistent performers in his firm by doing something that most amateurs fear. He reduced his entire trading universe to one breakout pattern. But what made his approach powerful wasn't the breakout itself. It was the clarity of his filter. His process was brutally simple. RS is greater than 90. Volume is greater than 150% of average. Stop placed tight under the pivot. Pyramiding only after confirmation. 4 filters. Not 20 indicators. Not a rotating watch list of trending narratives. Not 10 reasons to enter and 10 reasons to exit. 4 filters that shaped every decision from entry to risk. Anything that did not meet those filters didn't exist for him. He didn't waste time debating. He didn't scan the whole market every morning. He didn't question whether he should widen or tighten his stop based on how he felt. His process made the decisions before he even saw the chart. His mind was free, not because he was smarter, but because he had eliminated everything that weakened his judgment. When you reduce decisions, emotional load collapses, fear softens, doubt shrinks. Even discipline becomes easier because the system enforces discipline for you. You no longer wrestle with temptation or overthinking, because the structure removes those temptations altogether. The fewer decisions you allow, the better decisions you make. This isn't a motivational quote. It's cognitive science. Human working memory has limits. When you exceed those limits, accuracy collapses. Professionals design their process to stay inside those limits. Amateurs push beyond them constantly and blame themselves for the emotional fallout. This explains why professionals progress 10 times faster in 300 focused hours than amateurs progress in 10,000 scattered ones. Focus compresses experience. When you filter aggressively, every repetition strengthens the same neural pathway. The brain builds deep recognition. It starts to internalize patterns automatically. Execution becomes instinctive because the environment is consistent. Amateurs never build this instinct because they never repeat the same behavior long enough. They stay in perpetual analysis mode, always learning, but never mastering. There's another hidden reason. Elimination accelerates mastery. When you remove noise, you remove emotional turbulence. Rafi never realizes this because he mistakes information for safety. He believes every extra indicator protects him from loss. But every extra indicator actually introduces doubt. His emotions swing wildly because his environment is unstable. A complex screen produces complex emotions. A simple screen produces stable emotions. Professionals aren't calm because they're fearless. They're calm because their process reduces the number of emotional triggers they encounter. The power of focus as a filter also explains why Livermore traded entire bull markets with nothing more than a pencil, a pad, and the tape. He wasn't primitive. He was precise. He understood that clarity beats complexity, and that every unnecessary variable weakens the trader. His minimalism wasn't accidental. It was strategic. The tape gave him the behavior he needed. The pad allowed him to record pivotal levels. Everything else was noise. Modern traders think they're advancing because they have more tools. But the truth is harsher. More tools make them weaker, unless each tool serves the same narrow edge. This chapter also pushes the amateur versus professional identity divide deeper. Amateurs identify with the search for more indicators, more analysis, more opinions. Professionals identify with the commitment to less noise, less clutter, fewer distractions. Amateurs build complexity to feel prepared. Professionals build simplicity to stay consistent. These identities shape behavior, and behavior shapes results. When you adopt the identity of a professional, you naturally begin stripping away anything that doesn't strengthen your edge. You recognize that the mind performs best when it has fewer variables to track. You begin to value the discipline of reduction over the illusion of preparation. Rafi's story isn't a cautionary tale. It's the median path of most retail traders. They overthink because their environment forces them to. They lose confidence because their systems contradict themselves. They trade inconsistently because their inputs overwhelm their decision-making capacity. The professional's journey offers the antidote. Simplify until clarity emerges, and then repeat that clarity until it becomes a skill. The market rewards those who act cleanly under uncertainty. It punishes those who hesitate because their mind is juggling too many variables. But this chapter does more than contrast simplicity and complexity. It seeds the next major question, the one that leads directly to the mechanics of mastery. If focus is a filter, and if mastery comes from ruthless elimination rather than intense concentration, then how does a trader actually build a system that enforces focus automatically? How do you design a trading process that naturally reduces decisions, naturally limits noise, and naturally protects your emotional capital? How do you build structure so tight that discipline becomes easier than deviation? That question is the hinge of the entire video. It opens the door to the next transformation, constructing a repeatable framework where focus is baked into the architecture. Because elimination isn't a one-time act, it's a process. And professionals build this process deliberately. The viewer now understands why scattered effort fails and why clarity accelerates growth. They're primed to learn how to create a system that produces that clarity every single day. That system, and the protocol that governs it, is what we break down in Chapter 3. If focus is a filter, a system is the mechanism that applies that filter consistently. Even when fear tightens your chest, greed blinds your judgment, or impatience whispers that this time will be different. And this is the junction where amateurs quietly fall apart. Because amateurs rely on the unstable chemistry of mood, while professionals rely on the rigid architecture of protocol. You see this collapse most clearly in traders like Lena, who enters a clean breakout with perfect timing, watches the first surge, then feels price pause for a moment. That pause triggers a spike of fear, and she exits early, convinced she's being smart by reducing risk, only to watch price rip upward minutes later, forcing her into a frustrated re-entry at a terrible level that instantly punishes her with a stop-out. She doesn't lose because the market is cruel. She loses because she had no system to override her emotional reflexes. She believed the battle was between her and the chart. But the real battle was between her impulses and her absence of structure. Professionals know this truth so deeply it becomes instinct. The market doesn't beat you. Your lack of pre-commitment does. So pros eliminate that vulnerability by building rules that make emotional interference almost mechanically impossible. Their structure follows a simple, repeatable chain. Define the setup with precision, wait for the exact entry trigger, lock the stop beneath a structural level predetermined in calm hours, size the position using fixed risk parameters, accept the confirmation rules, or step aside, pyramid only with alignment of clear momentum criteria, and exit based on predefined signals rather than mood-driven guesses. There is no improvisation, no negotiation with fear, no adjusting stops, just this once. No impulsive adding to losers, because the market should turn. A prop shop I studied forced trainees to trade a single setup for 60 straight days with parameters so rigid they bordered on monastic discipline. Every trade risked 0. 5R, never more, never less. Every stop had to be placed under the same structural pivot for that pattern. Scaling was forbidden unless 3 pre-written criteria aligned. Stops could never be widened under any circumstances. Adding to losers was grounds for immediate suspension. For the first week, the trainees complained that the system was too tight, too inflexible, too restrictive, but the mentor simply smiled, because he knew something they didn't. Yet restriction accelerates recognition. By the third week, the noise in their minds had begun to fade. By the fifth week, they were executing without second-guessing. By the eighth week, something irreversible had clicked. They weren't struggling to control their emotions because the system had eliminated the situations where emotions could sabotage them. Their decision-making was no longer an open canvas. It was a narrow track, and narrow tracks lead to speed. This is the deeper truth amateurs never hear. Your discipline is not a personal virtue. It's an environment you design. Remove choices, and you remove emotional chaos. Professionals automate everything they don't trust themselves to handle in the heat of the moment, while amateurs keep all decisions open, believing flexibility is an advantage, when in reality, it's a psychological death sentence. This leads to the maxim that defines the entire chapter. Discipline is just automation in disguise. The amateur's version of discipline is a fragile promise made in the morning that collapses the moment volatility expands. The professional's version is a system that requires no willpower at all. Think about that shift. Amateurs try to become disciplined people. Professionals become architects of disciplined processes. Amateurs ask themselves, can I stay calm enough to follow my rules today? Professionals ask, how do I make it impossible not to follow my rules? And the moment you start asking that second question, mastery becomes a structural inevitability instead of an emotional aspiration. But here's the part few traders understand until they've lived it. Building a system is not the endpoint. It is the threshold. A system that removes emotional interference gives you consistency. But consistency alone will not give you mastery. Consistency is the engine. Selective repetition is the fuel. The traders from that prop shop didn't become masters because they followed rules. They became masters because they followed the same rules thousands of times in nearly identical situations. That's when pattern recognition shifts from intellectual to subconscious. That's when your brain starts noticing micro-tells in price action, subtle shifts in momentum, the difference between a breakout that wants to run and one that wants to fail. These cues don't come from hours, they come from focused hours inside the same narrow performance channel. It's the compounding of sameness that transforms an ordinary trader into a professional operator. But now a deeper question emerges, one that sets the stage for the next evolution. If you already have focus, and you already have a system, how do you accelerate mastery without adding complexity or increasing your workload? How do you grow faster without doing more? This is where most traders get lost, because they assume improvement always comes from expansion, adding setups, adding indicators, adding time frames, adding data. But in reality, mastery accelerates through simplification, narrowing, tightening, and refining. Once the system exists, once the emotional interference has been stripped out, once the process is repeatable, the next level is to leverage that repetition to create something exponential. And that is where the door opens to the idea that mastery is not built through more hours, but through deeper focus, applied to fewer repetitions with greater specificity. It raises the central tension at the heart of the journey so far. If focus gives you clarity, and systems give you consistency, then what gives you exponential growth? The kind of growth where your skill curve stops being linear and starts bending upward like a hockey stick. That's the question amateurs never think to ask, because they are still drowning in noise. But professionals know the answer intuitively. And it's that answer, how to accelerate mastery without adding more hours, that becomes the driving force of the next chapter. Professionals don't ascend to mastery by expanding their universe, they ascend by shrinking it, tightening it, narrowing it, until every behavior in their trading day runs along a single groove, repeated so many times it becomes automatic, intuitive, and nearly frictionless. And this is the secret almost everyone misses, because amateurs crave variety, the way beginners crave novelty. They believe variety equals growth. That jumping between strategies keeps them learning, that touching a dozen market conditions somehow makes them versatile. But professionals crave something radically different. They crave repetition, the boring, unglamorous, unsexy repetition of the same setup under the same rules, until their brain starts recognizing the market's micro-expressions, the same way a seasoned detective reads a suspect's face. A veteran trader once put it perfectly when he said, "Give me one setup and 500 repetitions. I'll build you a trader." And that line isn't poetic. It's a structural truth about how skill compounds. So imagine two traders starting on the exact same day with the exact same starting capital, the exact same screens, the exact same level of passion. Trader A spends 6 months hopping between reversals, momentum bursts, pullbacks, news-driven spikes, options sweeps, and futures scalps, convinced this variety is expanding their competence. But in truth, A builds nothing but surface-level understanding of many patterns and deep mastery of none. Every week, A resets the learning curve, starting from zero again and again because no pattern is repeated long enough to create depth. Meanwhile, Trader B does something amateurs find painfully restrictive. B trades only one setup. Not five, not three, not two, just one. A single high-volume breakout from consolidation near a pivotal level. That's it. Over 500 trades. B experiences conditions. A never sees long enough to recognize how the breakout behaves when volume surges early versus late, how price reacts when the consolidation is tight versus loose, how fake-outs form when the prior trend is exhausted, how stop-loss levels hold differently depending on volatility, how confirmation candles vary between market cycles, how liquidity pockets form above the pivot on strong days. These micro details are invisible to Trader A, because A is never immersed in one environment long enough for the brain to identify these subtle repeating markers. But Trader B sees them again and again, until pattern recognition becomes almost pre-conscious. B's decision latency shrinks. B's confidence stabilizes. B's emotional swings flatten because the environment is familiar. B's execution cleans up because nothing surprises them anymore. This is the heart of professional development. Not new information, but refined perception built through exposure to the same structure, repeated hundreds of times. This is why the maxim of the chapter lands so sharply. Mastery is the residue of narrow repetition, not scattershot repetition, not random hours, not exposure to many patterns, narrow repetition. The very thing amateurs avoid because they think it feels too simple. But in that simplicity lies depth, the kind of depth that echoes across careers. And this is where the 10,000-hour myth collapses under its own weight. It was never about time. It was about the type of time. 10,000 hours of scattered activity is just 10,000 hours of noise. But 500 to 1,000 focused repetitions of the same setup, executed under the same filters, the same risk rules, the same confirmation criteria, produce more growth than a decade of random experimentation. Professionals aren't collecting hours. They're collecting identical conditions. They're building a library of repetitions so deep that they can immediately detect when the setup is present, when it's distorted, when it's dangerous, and when it's at its highest quality. This is how they eliminate second-guessing. This is how they reduce cognitive load. This is how they accelerate skill even with fewer total hours than the average retail trader. But now the loop that began all the way back in Chapter 1 finally closes. The real path to mastery isn't time. It's focus leading to a system, and a system leading to repetition, and repetition leading to intuitive skill. And yet even this formula is missing its most critical final component. Because once a trader has focus, once they have a system, once they've built hundreds of repetitions of the same setup, the thing that separates them from true professionals is not their entries, not their exits, not their stops, not their risk. It's their ability to wait, not passive waiting, not bored waiting, but structured waiting, the mature, almost clinical patience that only emerges when you've seen a setup 1,000 times and you know exactly when something is off. You know when the volume signature is wrong. You know when the tape feels heavy. You know when the consolidation isn't clean enough. When the breakout level hasn't been tested long enough. When the liquidity pocket isn't where it should be. When participation is too weak. When the risk-to-reward profile doesn't justify taking the trade. This is the hidden transformation repetition creates. You don't just learn when to trade, you learn when not to trade. And that not trading is where the leap in performance truly happens. Amateurs think they need more trades. Professionals know they need fewer, but better ones. Amateur traders drown in overactivity because they don't have enough repetitions to trust the pattern. Every setup looks close enough, so they convince themselves to take it. But professionals with a deep repetition library can instantly see a misshapen version of their setup and step aside without hesitation. They aren't tempted by subpar trades because they've seen enough perfect ones to know what perfection looks like, and they refuse anything less. This is why repetition doesn't just build skill, it builds patience. Because patience isn't a moral trait. It's a byproduct of pattern familiarity. The more you've seen the real thing, the easier it is to ignore the imposters. And this right here is the threshold amateurs rarely cross. They think the next frontier of mastery is another indicator, another strategy, another time frame. But the final transformation, the one that turns repetition into instinctive wisdom, is the ability to wait for the exact setup that matches the library in your mind. This is the moment where all the chapters interlock. Focus gives you clarity, system gives you structure, repetition gives you competence, and waiting the final step gives you mastery. Because mastery isn't doing more. Mastery is finally knowing when to do nothing. And everything leading up to this point has been designed to prepare the trader for that final evolution. The shift from taking many trades to taking the right trades. From searching for opportunity to recognizing only the highest quality opportunities. From chasing randomness to waiting for inevitability. And it's that transformation, the trader who has repeated one setup so many times that they know exactly what they're waiting for, that becomes the core of Chapter 5, where the journey comes full circle and the final edge is revealed. After hundreds of repetitions, something subtle but profound shifts inside you. You stop craving action, and you start craving conditions. Because once your brain has seen the same setup again and again, action becomes cheap, but conditions become precious. And this shift marks the final transformation that amateurs almost never reach. Amateurs still believe that trading is about movement, activity, pushing buttons, being in the game. As if being flat somehow means they're not progressing. But professionals know the truth that feels counterintuitive, uncomfortable, even offensive to beginners. Waiting is a position, but only if you know exactly what you're waiting for. And that last clause, knowing exactly what you're waiting for, is what separates the trader who eventually stabilizes from the trader who burns out. Because without a repetition library, waiting becomes anxious, restless, empty. But with a repetition library, waiting becomes strategic, patient, selective, almost serene. And nothing illustrates this better than Marco, a seasoned trader I watched for an entire quarter. Marco took just 32 trades in 3 months. 32. 32. An amateur would shove that into a long weekend and call it progress. But every one of Marco's trades matched his setup with eerie precision. Same consolidation behavior. Same volume signature. Same tape acceleration. Same stop placement under the same structural pivot. Same confirmation trigger that only appeared when the breakout had real conviction. He wasn't passive. He wasn't scared. He wasn't lazy. He was selective. He filtered ruthlessly. He dismissed 90% of the market, not because he lacked opportunity, but because he knew exactly what opportunity looks like after years of narrow repetition. His result? Plus 18% with microscopic drawdowns. Meanwhile, sitting 3 desks over, an amateur trader executed 240 trades in the exact same period and finished the quarter. Negative. The amateur's logic was tragically familiar. More trades meant more chances, more learning, more data, more screen time hours. But in truth, the amateur wasn't learning. He was simply looping through random activity, accumulating emotional scar tissue instead of skill. Activity is seductive. Selectivity is profitable. And the divide between those two mindsets is where mastery resides. Here's the final maxim of this entire video, the one that closes every loop we opened from the first chapter to now. Professionals don't predict the market. They wait for the market to enter their memory. They don't guess. They don't anticipate. They don't hope. They wait, with almost clinical patience, for the pattern they've rehearsed hundreds of times to show up with the same structure, the same rhythm, the same energy signature. If it isn't there, they don't trade. If it is there, They execute without hesitation. That's the nature of real mastery. And when you see it in action, it looks boring. It looks slow. It looks almost too simple, which is why amateurs reject it. They think mastery involves complexity, multiple screens, multiple indicators, multiple strategies, constant action, non-stop engagement. But mastery, in reality, is about recognizing the handful of situations where you truly have edge and ignoring everything else. It's a kind of subtraction that feels unnatural at the beginning, but inevitable once you've accumulated enough repetitions to understand the difference between a maybe setup and a this is it setup. And this is where the entire journey of the video converges. Mastery is not time spent, not hours on charts, not late nights grinding through random trades, not 10,000 screens, not endless motion. Mastery is the compounding path. Focus creates clarity, system creates consistency, narrow repetition creates depth, and selective patience converts depth into real-world results. Now we close the first loop from Chapter 1, the one we seeded intentionally in the earliest minutes. If mastery isn't built from hours, what builds it? The answer is everything you've now walked through. Not time, but direction. Not effort, but precision. Not activity, but selectivity. The 10,000-hour myth collapses because it measures the wrong variable. It assumes hours create adaptation, but only focused hours, structured hours, repeated hours, patient hours build adaptation. The right hours, applied intentionally, compound in ways scattered hours never can. And once you've internalized this, something remarkable happens. Trading stops feeling like a frantic chase and becomes a disciplined wait. This is the moment when you finally stop acting like an amateur and begin operating like a professional. Because professionals don't fear missing trades, they fear taking trades that don't match their criteria. They don't fear boredom, they fear noise. They don't fear waiting, they rely on it. Waiting becomes a competitive advantage. Waiting becomes risk management. Waiting becomes clarity. Waiting becomes confidence. Waiting becomes the final stage of mastery. Marco didn't outperform because he was lucky. He outperformed because he had fewer decisions to make, and therefore fewer places for emotion to infiltrate. He wasn't wrestling his psychology every morning. His psychology was outsourced to his filters. And this is the lesson amateurs try to skip. Selective patience doesn't come from forcing yourself to wait. It comes from repeating a setup so many times that you develop an internal image of what right looks like, and then refusing anything less. This is the part of trading psychology most people misunderstand. Patience isn't willpower. Patience is memory. Patience is recognition. Patience is the residue of repetition. The amateur tries to be patient by telling themselves, don't enter early. Wait for confirmation. Don't chase. But that kind of patience collapses under stress because it has no internal anchor. The professional doesn't need reminders. They simply look at the market and instantly know whether the setup matches their internal library. If it does, the decision is obvious. If it doesn't, the decision is equally obvious. No agonizing, no bargaining, no fear of missing out spirals. This is the emotional neutrality that repetition creates. And that neutrality is why selective patience becomes effortless over time. This chapter, the final chapter, is the culmination of everything we've built deliberately throughout the script. Focus taught you what to ignore. Systems taught you how to behave. Repetition taught you what to recognize. Now patience teaches you when to act. And when these four pillars align, focus, system, narrow, repetition, selective patience, you no longer trade the market. You trade yourself, your criteria, your probabilities, your edge. You're no longer reacting to randomness. You're responding only to alignment. You're no longer chasing movement. You're waiting for memory. And that is the real secret behind mastery. The truth professionals know and amateurs never hear. You don't need 10,000 hours. You need the right hours, the ones spent in focus, inside a system, repeating narrow behavior until patience becomes instinct. This is how mastery is built in less time and with fewer mistakes. So here is your actionable recap, the distilled essence of the entire journey. Cut losses fast, size small, filter hard, repeat one setup until it becomes instinct, and wait for the market to show your conditions, not conditions that look good, not conditions that feel exciting, conditions that match your memory, the ones you've earned through repetition. That's the trader who grows. That's the trader who stabilizes. That's the trader who endures. And if this resonated, the next video on the psychology of waiting and the lost art of not trading will go even deeper into the mental architecture behind selective patience and the discipline required to execute scarcity in a world that pressures you toward constant action.